Hi guys and welcome back to SwitchUp. Now if you're feeling a sense of deja vu, do not panic. This is my second Animus review on Nintendo Switch. I've never re-reviewed a game before, like ever. Something just didn't feel right, like I'd missed the point. But as a human, we don't like to admit when we've maybe made a mistake, do we? It's much better to stick my head in the sand and just let the review stand as it is. Nope, not me, SwitchUp family, that is not me at all. So I started playing the game again, and as I played it, something did begin to click and make sense about the game and why my original, it's just trying to be Dark Souls and failing, probably wasn't a completely fair assessment of this game. Let's find out why. Animus is a game about two things: boss fights and loot. If that intrigues you, then watch on. Much like the Monster Hunter games that Glen and I both love, here you must be using a specific build to defeat certain bosses and enemies. I totally missed that the first time around and simply thought many of them were ridiculously overpowered to make me grind like a beast. Weapons have an elemental effect, and certain bosses will require you to experiment to find weaknesses. Hence a boss that 2 days ago felt like a nicely placed roadblock to force me to grind for absolutely ages, turned into a sad little cockroach, crushed under my new lightning boots. Levels are short 5 to 10 minute chunks that will see you usually fight through a group of enemies, collecting gems and coins, which you use later to improve your gear, and then eventually a boss fight at the end. You can circle strafe your enemies, and pressing X will roll or dash in a given direction, granting you some temporary invulnerability. Movement is a touch slow and can feel a little too clunky as you attempt to get behind enemies to backstab them. The speed of your character is affected by the weapon choice you make, which includes swords and shields, lances, dual blades, and gauntlets, as well as even hammers. Now, much of the combat is heavily lifted from my beloved Souls series, however I cannot help but feel that this is both a blessing and a curse. The combat in that series is so brilliantly handled, it never feels unfair, and reading enemies' movesets, but more importantly being able to react to them, feels possible. I found that with Animus, despite giving me many of the same moves and knowing where I wanted to go to evade damage, there were still times where it seemed impossible. Healing can be done 3 times per round and is done by pressing the L button and takes a while to implement, a lot like the Estus flask. During combat, certain button combinations will appear at the bottom of the screen. If you press these, you can absolutely devastate the enemy and knock them right back. While this little gauge in the corner gradually refills and acts as a berserk mode of sorts. Combat here is actually quite good though, when you understand what's going on, and here was the main problem: it wasn't really explained. You have a light and heavy attack as well as a dodge. Stamina is all important here, and your attacks and combos rely on you maintaining a high stamina. The same goes for defending with the shield. Boss enemies also have stamina, and sometimes your attacks may stagger or even floor them for a time, allowing you to wail on them unhindered. Now, I did say that each weapon has unique attributes and statistics, and the aim here is to match those with the boss you're fighting. After progressing beyond where I had for the first review, the experience also opened up, allowing you to summon fallen warriors in certain fights. I did have to grit my teeth a little once again at just how similar that is to Dark Souls, but hey ho, does it affect the actual game? Well, it makes fights more interesting, but these computer controlled assistants just really act as decoys, allowing me to wail on the larger bosses for a time unhindered. So the game is about building a character strong enough to defeat a boss, These in turn will drop, gradually improving gear, and the cycle continues. In that regard, it's more akin to Diablo meets Monster Hunter. When you do reach a tough one, as I did, these blue shields are essentially farming spots. They allow you to defeat a boss to farm the parts for a weapon of the element required to defeat that tough boss, and this is where I got stuck the first time round. Now, I don't like that at all as a gameplay mechanic. In my opinion, that's just a lazy way around refining the levels and systems before you reach that tough enemy. So, to be honest, my point stands in that regard. Thankfully, I was able to get the parts I needed relatively quickly and could progress with the main story after defeating that boss. There are side missions here as well, and these are shown in a different colour separate on the overmap. Some of the best fights were in these side quests. Here is where the game improved the most past the initial roadblock or rage block that I'd hit. The boss fights themselves, there are so many bosses in the game. They range from skinny knights, who you will learn pretty quickly and ruin, to absolute behemoths that will require strategic in and out attacks. I originally reduced them all down to circle strafe fests, and I hate to say it, that's probably not fair. There are some great fights to be had here. Many of the issues I had with it remain. Its mobile origins are still clear in the setup. Levels are incredibly short, and things like using special gems to revive when you die is classic pay to win 101. And despite that being no part of the game, it still creates a more casual experience, allowing you to essentially save up these and then use them to revive several times to reduce a tough fight to a respawn fest. The story, it's decent enough, albeit a very cliche one to begin with. It just becomes confusing quite quickly, and an ability to recap the prior game's lore would have been welcomed. The cutscenes at the start are nice, but it's soon replaced with text-only story segments that felt slightly less impactful. The implementation still isn't perfect. Story scores 12 out of 20. The gameplay though is the main difference in this review right here. The game is far deeper than I first thought. Your character levels quite quickly, and combat is decent if not excellent. It is the later boss fights and emphasis on tailoring your builds to match them that has changed my opinion on it. The main thing, I guess, is that the gameplay loop becomes very addictive as you progress. That doesn't excuse it for not hooking me in right away though, and they need to do more to teach the player, rather than these irritating flashes of tutorial that pop up on the screen. Overall though, gameplay is definitely improved and scores 14 out of 20. Visually, the game runs at a decent click, 60 frames per second. Textures are pretty hideous in the environment, with little to no shadows, bump mapping, or even a brightness control that I could find. Character animations are average on your own character, but some of the boss fights have decent movesets that look really nice. I really did my due diligence this time around and played through an hour on my phone, and I can say that the Switch version looks better and certainly runs faster. In handheld, the game belts along at native resolution, but cannot belie the textures I've mentioned. The main difference again are the bosses. The latter ones just look so much better than some of the earlier fights. Developer note to selves, put an epic boss fight right at the beginning to hook people in. You're welcome. This extends to their movesets and some of the environments you fight in also. Everything improves as you play. Audio sounds just like Dark Souls, it really does. In that regard, it's decent enough. The problems lie with the tie between audio and visuals, which is slightly non-existent from a musical standpoint. Gone are the sweeping vistas of Lodran, to be replaced with the dusty, pixelated stones of this place. Combat sounds are possibly the best part of the game. They're meaty and sync up well with the on-screen action. Visuals score 13 out of 20 and audio scores 14 out of 20. It cost around £7.99. The game is quite long, and while I originally panned the value, I am going to still pan the value a little bit. Here's why. While there is plenty to do here, you are at times encouraged to grind parts by completing the same bosses time and time again. Main and side quests amount to a decent chunk of unique gameplay though, but I also question why the Switch release is almost double the price of the iOS game. That being said, I was wrong about the core experience not being worth your time. It gets quite addictive, but can also be irritating. Overall, I'd say 1 for the sales. Value scores 13 out of 20. Well, that was a first for me in the channel. I had this little itch in the back of my mind to give the game more time, and I'm glad I did. While interestingly new issues arose I didn't see the first time around, also a much more positive gameplay experience was had when the mechanics were made clear. The developer will have to make this more explicit going forward, but it turns a game I would have happily refunded a few days ago into one I am annoyingly quite enjoying now. Animus receives a SwitchUp score of 66%. I appreciate the feedback and support you guys have given me when I made the decision to redo this review. Look, the games industry and YouTube is filled with people who just want to get content out quickly and they don't care about the people behind the scenes. That is not us at SwitchUp, and it never will be, so thanks again. For all things Switch all the time, Happy New Year, see ya. See ya!